in, again, difficult times. I'm very glad that you made it and that you don't abandon and still come. I'm extremely pleased tonight, not only for the topic, which is very controversial, very interesting, but because this topic is discussed by our two curators. TESSA is curating the series on philoxenia, which means the Gastfreundschaft, the love for the other. And Nina is the curator of Russia on the world stage. So combining these two excellent ladies was really thrilling and very challenging. And I want to thank you both that you sit together as colleagues and debate, I guess, in a very controversial way, because you have different approaches, I guess. But this is exactly what this debate is meant to be. And I'm very curious to find out in which direction we go, in the Kissingerian or in the meddling through like people are doing today. Thank you again for coming, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Gertraud. This is such a nice introduction, Nina. You get this probably more often, but I don't. Not really. Seldomly called excellent lady. But also the way I see this evening, of course, is not exactly among equals, because Nina Khrushcheva is a professor for international politics at the New School in New York. She is teaching for years. She's writing in all sorts of journals, from the New York Times to what would you say, to what's the other end of the spectrum?
Nothing, doesn't matter.
The Moscow Times. While I'm more a journalist living in London, watching all the world's politics in amazement passing by. But I'm very happy that we are here, and I'm also happy to discuss this topic, which we were just actually musing about the fact how to deal with Henry Kissinger, who means something else to people here than in other parts of the world. You know, while we were discussing just now that Nina was saying he just published a book about artificial intelligence. He's 98 years old. Yeah, so alone for that, the man, of course, deserves our respect for keeping sane in a world like this for an entire century. Is quite an achievement. But in another context, of course, he's a much more controversial man. And we were actually thinking, would we invite Henry if he would agree to come? Because he might not. Would we invite Henry Kissinger to Kreisky Forum? What do you think, Nina? What do you think, Gertraud?
I don't know. What do you think? Would we invite Henry Kissinger?
Well, it could be interesting. I mean, I told Nina the other day that my first guest, actually before I was entrusted to head the Kreisky Forum, my first guest was Alexander Yakovlev, who, like history says, was the mastermind or the colleague or the mind behind Gorbachev in Glasnost and in Perestroika. And nobody thought that it was possible to have him here in the Kreisky Forum. He was a figure, he was a very important person. And so we organized a small talk with him, because we thought that he might not be, he was also kind of 90-something, that he would not hold through a whole talk in the evening. And we thought maybe we do half an hour conversation with him, and then we give him something to eat, and at 8 o'clock he would want to go home and go to sleep. But it was the contrary. At 8 o'clock he was still sitting in the living room and discussing and debating with the people. So this historical figures are really amazing.
Well, especially in the sense, if we discuss Kissinger's realpolitik, I think maybe one approach would be also to show him an invitational politics and include him in the real politics and say, like, whatever you did in the past, you could also sort of talk about it, educate us. But the main point of our discussion tonight, as it's called, was Henry Kissinger right after all, big question mark, is that we are now in a situation where we here in Vienna sit between the East and the West, I want to say, but Nina watches it from New York and from Moscow at the same time, given that COVID restrictions allow you to travel. And we are wondering if this is a moment where the Western model is not working as well as we thought. And if it is a moment where the West, that doesn't even exist as the West anymore, but if it's a moment where Kissinger would advise to deal with the so-called bad guys, Putin and Xi, so the Russian and the Chinese president, in a different way, since the classic Western ways have not worked, and if it's time for a new approach. So this is more or less sort of the frame question for our talk tonight. And so Nina, I would like to ask you first, if you think of Kissinger's realpolitik in his time, to start with a more historical context, what was the important thing for you?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kreisky Forum, for inviting me. Again, it is my first trip to Europe. So, hey, I'm very excited to be out of two worlds such as Russia and America. Very wonderful. To your invitation of Alexander Yakovlev versus Henry Kissinger. Alexander Yakovlev is a hero to the West because he was the father, or so he says, although Gorbachev disputes it every day. The father of perestroika, so the father of that way of life that you are describing in Russia, that is democratic values, the glasnost, the perestroika, the openness, and so on. Henry Kissinger, on the other hand, is the father of realpolitik, who, just to remind you in simple terms, an argument that you need to deal with every country the way the country is, rather than telling every country how we think the country should be. Since you ask about history, you do remember that Henry Kissinger was Richard Nixon's Secretary of State. And when Richard Nixon discovered and kind of opened to China, or discovered China in a sense, which was a no at the time for an American president. It would be the same as discovering North Korea today. I'm sure you remember those days. I mean, Donald Trump did, it's amazing. I mean, Donald Trump is no longer president. We just cannot go 5 minutes without mentioning his name. When Donald Trump discovered North Korea, when he wanted to be friends, it was something like that, but not something like that, because for Trump, it was a PR opportunity. For Nixon, it was a political opportunity. And Tessa and I actually talked about this. Remember that when Nixon took, when Kissinger took Nixon to China, Mao Zedong was already a very old, somewhat decrepit and slightly crazy man. And, some would argue that he was crazy right from the beginning, kind of in a Stalin-esque crazy. In fact, you may remember that one of the arguments that he had with Nikita Khrushchev is that Mao wanted Khrushchev to help develop nuclear weapons for China so he can use it. And Khrushchev would say, well, I think we should just wait for that because this is not going to end well for all of us. So Nixon and Kissinger went to China, and according to many experts, I'm not an expert on China, but I know Ian Buruma, who is a British and Dutch author. I'm sure he was here at the Kreisky Forum, probably even mentioned that. He tells the story of how Mao was essentially completely out of his mind, but it's in Chinese. who knows whether he was out of his mind. And so Nixon and Kissinger would pretend or present Mao's gibberish as some great, wonderful thoughts, which seemed ridiculous at the time, but actually worked out in realpolitik terms, because when Mao died, it allowed this relationship that was built between the United States and China at the time, allowed Deng Xiaoping to be the Alexander Yakovlev or Gorbachev of the time, although of course China, the Chinese aspirations were not similar to the Soviets, not that they were becoming a free and open society, but they wanted capitalism, they wanted trade. And Nixon delivered for them because he gave, and that's what realpolitik is all about. You give the country, in order to deal with the country, you give them what they want. I mean, not nuclear weapons, but you give them what they want. You recognize the desire of that political entity. And so in this sense, we can say that realpolitik has not been used in later years because Tessa mentioned the kind of the Western environment. And I would actually argue that it's not that democracy or the West or Western formulas are not working the way we thought they should. I think they are working fine. It's just they are not applied the way they should, and not by every country. And so I guess when we thought about this, and I've been thinking about Henry Kissinger and another great mind of the second half of the, more than second half of the 20th century, George Kennan. And I mentioned him in this audience very often because very proudly, I was his research assistant. I was his last research assistant. He would say that putting him together in the same sentence with Henry Kissinger is a crime. And he was not arguing for realpolitik, but his main view of foreign policy or international politics was that when you define what the country is, or you decide what you want from this country, you look at it not from perspective of how you want it to be or to see it, but how it thinks of itself and of the world. And his great expertise was, of course, Russia. He was an ambassador to the Soviet Union under Stalin, but he was a great thinker. So one time he was in Germany and he said something critical of Stalin. So he was kicked out of Moscow in 24 hours, very quickly. And then he became a scholar of Russia and the Soviet Union. And you know, he's a creator of the kind of, to some degree, containment theory, although of course he would say that it was deeply misinterpreted. And containment theory was the way to deal with the Soviet Union. That is, you contain its worst inclinations, communist inclinations, and yet you deal with it in smaller, concrete terms. It's not exactly Kissingerian, but the amazing thing that today they almost become the same, although of course neither of them would agree that they
partisan.
They would stand at the same. I mean, actually, well, they were both Republicans. Kennedy then became a Democrat because Republicans thought that he was not tough on the Soviet Union enough, and they just kicked him out of the party. But in some ways, I think that pragmatic, in a sense, the pragmatic approach is something that may be in use today.
Well, I mean, the example you give of Mao, Kissinger went further than having a pragmatic approach. He was basically saying, if you meet a mad person, don't treat him as a mad person.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
in that sense, I think this might come in handy now because we obviously have a few rather mad dictators a little bit further to the east, which you could argue we have to treat as normal in order to keep a channel of communications open, even if Russian diplomats or FSB officials are being thrown out of the window in the German capital out of the Russian embassy in the middle of the day, just because. And somebody dies, and nobody is even astonished about it anymore, that these things happen, as if that's a normal way of treating the people who work for you. I mean, you know, it's not even opposition. It's sort of their own system, and that's rather difficult to deal with, of course.
But I don't think anybody's treating it as a normal thing. I mean, the Russians would say there's no information available, leave us alone. Of course, then all these conspiracy theories are running around.
Germans behind it.
German. Well, no, there's actually not yet, not there. But I don't think treating as normal is something that it's happening. But I also would like to push back a little bit on a dictator, because one of the things that I live in America. It's a country of black and white. It's either all good or all bad. And it's always the other side that is guilty. So Putin has been a dictator there for 10 years, but he's evolving and it's getting worse. But if we look at political terms, it's not a dictatorship yet. So please, when people started going to gulags en masse, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to call that? So I would say it's a strong authoritarian system. I would not even go in China, which is worse. I would still not go there as a dictatorship, because if you look at numbers, and I do look at numbers of killed people, that also matters. There are incredible amount of injustice in Russia and even more amount in China, but it's not comparable to what we call dictatorship of Mao or Stalin. And I would be very careful in using those terms.
Oh, for sure. I was not
because when you said a dictator,
Stalin at all, yeah. But I would argue a little bit with the question if numbers matter so much. I think it's a question of systemic abuse of power also. So if you look at the Chinese regime today, the treatment of the Uyghurs, that is sort of, for some people already genocide, and we will see also how that develops. This is of deep concern, you know, there where you call then a regime that is very authoritarian a dictatorship. That's sort of, you know, we're starting really to shift in a very sensitive area, but where if you are an Uyghur at the moment in a camp there, then you're probably
you would say it's in a very unfree, it's a very unfree society. But I would, because I teach politics, and you know, you only give students an inch and they will just take the whole arm. So if you tell them that something is a dictatorship, then they just start saying if they're disagreeing with something. And you know, in America, you hear it all the time. Well, Trump was a dictator. He wasn't. I mean, he was an aspiring authoritarian. The system stopped him. But it wasn't just Trump. Remember Dick Cheney? Everybody remembers Dick Cheney? Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the vice president of the United States in 2000, the man who was given a job to vet the vice presidents, looked around, asked him the most embarrassing questions in the world, who now, by the way, Liz Cheney, who is the hero of America now because she voted against Trump, his daughter, she's a representative from Wyoming. Suddenly she's on a Democratic side, but she was the one who developed that incredible questionnaire. 6 people answered those embarrassing questions. Dick Cheney looked at this like, you know what? I think I'm going to be the vice president. So, you know, dictators or dictatorial formulas or dictatorial aspirations can exist everywhere. And then, of course, there are the culture, the political formulas that help, the legal system that doesn't work, as it doesn't work in Russia. But as I said, since Putin is going to be there for many years to come, since he's now Tsar for life, Putin the First, essentially, as you know, he changed the constitution last year so he can stay on. I mean, it doesn't mean that he would necessarily, but he can and probably will. So what are we going to do? Exactly. What are we going to do when people do go to prisons en masse? I mean, when Alexei Navalny, who everybody knows, I don't need to explain who that is, when he returned from Germany, put into put in prison, in detention camp. I put on a window, I put a sign, "Free Navalny." My neighbors came to me and said, "We agree with you, but you can't do this because you can't mention Navalny's name." And I said, "Well, if you agree, if we all put in a window, "Free Navalny," they're not going to arrest the whole building." But no. And so I didn't take it off. And actually then I took that off and I put another one saying "Free non-Putin." And they came in again 5 days later. It wasn't 2 hours later, but 2 days later. And they said, "Please take it off. We agree with you," and whatnot. And I said, "I'm not going to take it because there's no Navalny name." And they said, "We'll call the police." And you know what? I took it off because I don't want the police in my house just in case. So this is still not a dictatorship, because in a dictatorship, you're not going to be asked any of these questions.
But you all behave as if you're in a dictatorship. Your neighbors and you.
You accept the pressure, that's for sure. Actually, that's how Putinism and SZYSZKOWITZ and whatever happens, because we allow a little bit and then we allow a little bit more and allow a little bit more.
And don't misunderstand me, I would be probably the first one who gives into political pressure and try to save my children.
No, I feel embarrassed. I'm very open about this. But
there's structural things in Russia, in the society, that also allow this development. And my question would be to stay a little bit on the sort of development also of this relationship that the West, after the end of communism, had with Russia, and this at the time emerging, as we thought, democracy. What do you think went wrong? What would have helped at that moment in the 90s to maybe change the course of what Putin then, from the beginning of his reign in 1999, 2000, actually did? I mean, would anything that the West had done change what happened later in Russia?
Well, I mean, well, first of all, Russia is Russia. It will always be Russia. One of the mistakes is to think that it's just going, with all its 11 time zones, just please remember that it's very big. It goes from Kaliningrad, Königsberg, which used to be Germany, Prussia, into all the way to the Pacific Ocean. You can actually see China. Actually, Sarah Palin, one of the great figures of American politics, said that she sees great intellectuals. She sees Alaska from her backyard. So it's a giant country. It's a continent. So just imagine, pardon me?
Isn't she from Alaska? Yeah, the other way around. She wanted to say that she
sees, right, she sees Russia from her backyard. She says, we're very close to the Russians. So Japan is there, Alaska is there, Germany is there. So imagining only Alexander Yakovlev, who did not have access, I mean, 11 time zones is very difficult to have access to the world, would think that this enormous body is going to turn around and just say, oh, okay, we're going to give up all of those traditions and imperial ambitions and everything else. I mean, they tried. But even Boris Yeltsin, who is the great Democrat of our imagination, let's think about it. The fact that he declared himself anti-communist never made him a Democrat. And we really wrote about this and spoke about this. But you want, not you, you don't. But since the leadership of the free world, as they often say, is in America, America wants everybody to be like them. I mean, look, Afghanistan was supposed to become like them. Iraq was supposed to be like them. Everybody and their mother is supposed to be like them. So nobody would really ask those small questions. And when Boris Yeltsin, for the fight for democracy, as they claim, went and shelled his own parliament, which, yes, was incredibly conservative and communist, but once again, in a democracy, you are not doing those things. And yet he did. He wasn't reprimanded. And then the war in Chechnya happened. Remember that? That was 94. What was the reason to go there? Once again, oh, it's bad. That's okay. Russia is a democracy. So the steps are being made. And once again, as I said, you know, the little, we allow first time to threaten us, and then we give up and give in. And then a second time, So Yeltsin was not reprimanded. Yeltsin stayed on. He was a great Democrat. He had elections in '96. He had 2%, 3% approval. He hired an American firm. They made him into a presidential candidate. He got reelected in '96. So all this are non-authoritarian, but these are not democratic either. So none of these things with, Russia was never really that kind of a democracy. It was much freer society under Yeltsin. I'm not arguing with that, but it was never really that democratic value system that we talk about. And then let's go to the question of Putin. I'm sorry, I'm answering it slightly longer, but I think it's important. So Yeltsin wanted to preserve, because there are issues and corruption issues, although of course, comparing to today, Yeltsin's 15 million that were his legacy for the family and so on, it's nothing, it's peanuts. But at the time, it seemed like a giant sum of money. So he wanted to be sure that his legacy and his money and his properties and his children and his everything is being preserved. So he was looking for a proper prime minister. Those of you who remember or know Russian history or recent Russian history, remember, I think he went through like 6 of them or 5 of them. There was a lot of them. And then he finally settled on this great former KGB colonel, Vladimir Putin. Why would that man, in all the much more talented and much more interesting people, would be that candidate? But he was that candidate because that man was, he knew where the bodies were buried. He knew that nobody would challenge Yeltsin. So that transition of power was not necessarily democratic. Then comes Putin, then he's a former KGB, and we know that former KGB never becomes a former KGB and whatnot. And then going back to Gorbachev, Gorbachev was promised that NATO would not expand, that we're just going to keep it the way it is. And suddenly it expands, and suddenly it happens. And Putin, when he comes in, he's still young and bright and thinks he's going to stay there for a few years, make enough money, and then move to Germany, which is the country of his dreams. He says, I think in 2000, he just became president. He said, well, I don't really see as NATO we are part of the West. He says Russia is a Western country, and I don't see NATO as a threat in any way. Then NATO expands, then he's not listened to, then he's not paid attention to, then he's dismissed, then he has all the grievances, then Dick Cheney, I'm sorry, love Dick Cheney, because he's such an oxymoron of democracy. Forget Trump, I mean, Dick Cheney is a much greater oxymoron. So then Dick Cheney in 2006 goes to Lithuania and says, Putin is not a Democrat. Putin says, I'm sorry, and you are. And so then it just goes, and all goes back to what we talked about with Henry Kissinger and Mao Zedong and then Deng Xiaoping, because Henry Kissinger allowed Deng Xiaoping to get what he wanted. He wanted to have trade relations with the world. He wanted China to be that source of cheap products and lead toys and whatnot that we until recently loved to buy. The only thing Putin wanted at the time is he wanted respect. He wanted, so Russia would sit at the same table and would be treated like those Eastern thing. It's not even East European, it's some thing, some Russian thing. And he didn't get it.
But Nina, I mean, I have a great respect for the theory of respect being one of the most important political categories in our world, because I think it's really true that one needs to respect the others and not have a kind of Anglo-Saxon idea that everyone who is not hasn't been part of the elite of the British Empire will never be able to live up to the brilliance of a diplomat and a politician. But I still wonder if Putin would have developed in a more democratic way, if maybe this, trigger happy young economists from Harvard in the beginning of the 90s wouldn't have slashed out their economic programs and say like, just adopt it, guys, this is great. Yeah, because I have the sad feeling that maybe politics and in the Russian case in particular is also more complicated and has more to do also with a system that was, you know, overwhelmed by itself, and that the West maybe was not always respectful enough, but also didn't do everything wrong, because after all, you know, Putin was invited to join the G7 as the G8.
Yeltsin.
Okay, but Russia was invited to join, and if and it could have happened. You know, I saw it now in Glasgow last week, a UN conference. The whole world is expected to come. It would have been great if they all would have come. Who does not come? Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And you think like, lost opportunity, guys. I know lots to do with fossil energy coming out of the ground, not easy, but you know, go and speak to the people who invite you, because then you have a better chance to get heard and get respect.
You sound like Biden. And that's exactly what he did. He just showed them, and they, of course, showed back. Thinking, good thing we didn't come, because we really don't need more lectures from you people.
Yeah, but it wouldn't have been a lecture. Every leader of a state there had the right to speak. And, you know, of course, Joe Biden is Joe Biden and he thinks he's the big man, yeah. But it would have been a really, of course, you know, you have to be one of the leaders there, yeah. And you have to make space also to the little guys who come and speak to the Africans who say like, you know, help us out, and to the little Europeans and all this. But it would have been a really good idea, especially in order to save the planet maybe, but also in the sense that when you are already invited, do go please, because then afterwards to complain that you don't get enough respect, to me is a bit of a cheap excuse for being not democratic.
Okay, that's fine. I'm with you to some degree. And also I want to say that it's not that we're disagreeing. I'm just trying to explain that after 20 years of bashing Putin, clearly that did not work out. So yes, you say in 2021, don't complain about no respect because you didn't show up for that climate conference. He would say, and he did say, is that I showed up before, there was no respect. Why would I show up now? I spoke on the, whatever it is, on the monitor, and that should be enough. No, I agree with you that they should have come, but I also disagree that it was Joe Biden's place to once again stick it to them that they didn't. And another thing, I mean, you actually mentioned something I think very, very important. It's not that yes, the West came in, or America came in with the Harvard and Chicago boys that just said, that's how we do it. And that's, if you do it the same way, it's just going to be wonderful. And that was, of course, the country that never knew what not planned economy was, never knew what democracy was, because let's remember that before now probably less so, although still we talk about, or we in Russia talk about the pre-revolutionary system, pre-communism, as if it was just some the most amazing thing that ever happened, and then horrible communists came in and just broke it. I would like to remind you that it was an absolute monarchy, just, you know, very important. So the whole system was always absolute. Russian Christianity is not in vain called Orthodox Christianity. It's a fundamentalist religion. Russia is big, and therefore it moves slower. And the system, you know, Putin came up with this vertical of power. Putin didn't come up with a vertical power. There's always been a vertical of power. There's always the Kremlin and then everything top down. So of course, the Western economists, the Western politicians who came in, American politicians and economists who came in the 1990s, couldn't have known any of this. The problem is they didn't bother the way they didn't bother in Afghanistan. Because if you only pay attention, how could you not know that the Ashrafi government is not the government that is going to stand? It's the same thing. You come in, you think, McDonald's works great, so it's going to be wonderful here. So that is a problem. The problem is not that they didn't know, the problem that they didn't bother to find out. And of course, the Russians were ready to embrace it, as other countries were ready to embrace it. I'm not blaming Americans or the West, because Russia also is that very ossified system. And Putin may or may not have been different with NATO expansion. I would argue that, of course, there is some responsibility on the Western part, but also there is something about Russia. It's always, you know, we had a wonderful, one of those prime ministers that were changing, Viktor Chernomyrdin, who had very colorful language, and he would always use this almost incomprehensible lines, but at the same time very, very pertinent. So one time he said, "We want it for the better," and it turned out to be like always. So in some ways, they wanted democracy for the better, but it just turned out to be like always. So I think with the Russian case, and I don't know, I mean, I don't know enough about China. I can only talk about Kissinger because I'm just interested in that Kissingerian moments. Is it a chicken and egg problem? You know, if you talk to the Polish, they would say, of course. I mean, we would never even expect Russia to be anything different, or the Baltics, we would never expect anything to be different. But I'm not sure. I think it's, you know, it takes two to do tango. And I think in the geopolitical environment, it takes many more than two to do tango. Maybe that's the problem, because we don't have bilateral relations, we have multilateral, and everybody has their own interests. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that the picture is more complex than it is. And I would like, once again, and I know it's very tiring, to remind you that Russia is 11 time zones. Just 11 time zones. So when people in Kaliningrad wake up, there is deep night already somewhere else. So it's a continent. Can you change a continent in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years?
Well, I mean, if you think of Russia in real terms, the power center is very much on the western side of the country and in Moscow. And it has always been, I mean, sort of, or in St. Petersburg, but sort of on the European side. And so I think we can also say, like, if there would be a liberal reform movement in democratic terms in that part of the country, there would be a good chance that the rest would come along. I would hope so. Yeah?
I'm actually not sure. I actually went last time I spoke here, I did a trip exactly to find that out. I went from Kaliningrad to all the way to the Pacific Ocean to Kamchatka. And I'm not that certain anymore that if the changes come in Moscow, it would change. In fact, I discovered that Vladivostok, which is on the Pacific Ocean, is an incredibly more cosmopolitan than Moscow, St. Petersburg, which should be an oxymoron, but it's not. I mean,
No.
it is. It's an incredibly cosmopolitan city.
But that also means there would be chances to have reform movements from there, like we saw in the demonstrations, right?
Yes.
If it's against the pension reform or democracy.
But that's my point, is that we really don't know. I mean, Vladivostok would not come to Moscow, but it's also not clear whether the reforms from Moscow would come from Vladivostok as well.
But let's talk a little bit more, because I was thinking this afternoon how in the European context, realpolitik was always, you know, that it's not an accident that the term in English is realpolitik, not only because it was coined with Kissinger, who of course was a German Jew who had to flee the Third Reich, but also because I think in the European context, pragmatism and a detente between the great powers was sort of the crucial thing in order to try to solve all these movements and shifts in the power battle of the kings and queens up to the democratic age. And so if you had Metternich on the Wiener Congress and the attempt to have Austria and Prussia to balance out Russia and France, or the other way around, depended on who you were. Yeah? Right. But then also Bismarck in a similar attempt to see that nobody gets totally left out, and nobody is the only one that is the only queen or king. Right. And so Kissinger came from this culture, political culture, also saw how it can completely go wrong in the case of Germany in the 30s. But so I wonder if you apply this to today, so the idea of a pragmatic approach in world politics to balance out the powers, what can Europe even do here now? I mean, we are quite potent as European Union in an economic sense. We are not always at the same page politically. So if you look now in the approach to Russia, you had with Angela Merkel basically a realpolitik person in charge. She was quite clear in human rights terms, but she was not sort of out on a crusade against Putin or with anti-Russian undertones that would make you feel uneasy. So I wonder how you see now if there will be a change in tone coming from a German government that might be social democratic Greens and liberals who are all asking for a little bit more of a tougher tone towards Russia, also towards China.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I always thought that with Europe, it's been many years since Marshall Plan, right? And so I thought that Europe should have claimed its own independence and other powers long before Emmanuel Macron started talking about, we need a European center versus always following the United States. So that has been my approach. So yes, certainly the realpolitik has been actually, in fact, in this audience some years ago, I was talking about Putin, of course, what else? And one of the guests said, and talking about how the United States misunderstands and misinterprets, because it sees everything in terms of it's either for us or against us. There's a woman stood up and said, yes, what happened to diplomacy? And I keep asking this question myself all the time, what has happened to diplomacy? I really don't know, because Merkel was brilliant in dealing with Putin. For example, she would, as you know, she would stand her ground in human rights, and then the next day she would go and visit him in the Kremlin. Like, how do you argue with that? So she would not go when the Sochi Olympics and everybody boycotted it. So she didn't come to the Sochi Olympics because of Ukraine's situation in Ukraine. And then he came to Moscow 2 days later. She didn't come for the 9th of May celebration, which is the victory day in Russia after World War II, which is, of course, Russia calls it the Great Patriotic War. But she came on May 10th. I mean, you can't really argue with this. I mean, so Putin can't quite say to her, you are part of the, although, he tried to insult her nonetheless, but she really stood her ground quite brilliantly. I really don't know how it happens. But we also remember that in your European Union, there are quite a lot of Putin's supporters. We have Viktor Orban, who is not going anywhere.
Who knows? For the first time now.
For the first time, he may.
Well, there's an opposition forming against him from very different.
Well, it has happened before, so we'll see. But even so, it's not exactly the unified voice. But what I'm trying to argue, I guess, that Putin himself is not going anywhere. There is no opposition. He really demolished all the potential. In fact, elections happened in the Duma, in the Russian parliament. And since the opposition, Navalny opposition, and everybody else were either in prison or exiled or, taken away from the ballot. So the Communist Party, I mean, that's an irony of the century. The Communist Party really became an opposition to the United Russia Party, the Putin Party, and did very, very well until the ballots were somehow rigged in the electronic voting. And so suddenly the Communist Party lost the advantage. I mean, they still did really well, but in numbers. Some people looked at the numbers. So the Communist Party took 19% of the vote and the United Russia Party took 49. But in actual terms, the Communist Party probably took 30% and United Russia 35. So United Russia would come on top, but much, much less so. So what happens afterwards? So now suddenly the Communist Party becomes the opposition that needs to be threatened and taken away and taken out. So Putin is not going to get better. So how to deal with it? And I am of two minds. If I ask Henry Kissinger, we may ask Henry Kissinger, he would say he's not going to change. You just have to find common ground with how to deal with whatever it is, but also don't blanketly sanction him for everything and accuse him of everything, because that's another, I don't know about Europe, but in America, if something happens, that must be Russia's fault immediately. Nobody's even going to investigate. It's the Congress. Some congressman comes out and says that because we know that's the Russians. We know everything. So Kissinger would say, don't do this, because if you give Putin that much power, and by the way, let's remember he's a KGB man. So even if it's a negative power, for him, it's power. It doesn't matter. He loves that kind of attention and that kind of power that is given to him by, look what I can do. So don't give it to him. Deal with him in this incremental moments. So they do something that is beneficial. You take a little bit of sanctions off. Then if it doesn't work, you take it back. But really have him, I don't know if it works anymore, because maybe we're already so far off that it's not going to work. But even 5 years ago, it could have been possible. So give him something to work for, so he knows that his behavior would be rewarded, like carrots and sticks, actually what George Kennan would say. But it never happened. It was always, kind of a blanket, let's close all the representation of Russia in the United States except for the embassy. So let's close them in every single place. So that what I think would be Kissingerian model to deal with it in detailed function. Something that Joe Biden says they do, but I haven't seen them doing any of this. Although there've been reports that they talk about Iran, they talk about China, because one of the things that the United States should have worked with Putin on, and who goes to China when you can have the West, please? And especially the Russians that are technically Western, they just, because never recognized by the West, so they always say, we don't want you. We don't need you. They could have worked on these nuclear agreements with China. They are not. They haven't, they've been bashing the Russians instead of actually asking them for help. There have been some attempts, but it didn't happen because you don't trust the Russians, they don't trust you, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if we have a solution to this anymore. But in my view, I think the time was lost when it could have happened, because there was so much post-Crimea, there was so much anger and resentment that instead of making everything about Crimea, Crimea should have been bracketed and Russia should have been dealt with in other terms on diplomatic level.
I have to disagree on this a little bit, because I'm not a big fan of sanctions, and I think even economic sanctions are being seen nowadays not as a blanketing exercise or easily handed out, especially not the country like Russia, which Austria, for example, is dependent upon in terms of energy supply. But what happened was that, and you may say that Crimea has always felt very Russian, but it was part of another country. And I think if we in Europe or anywhere just say like, okay, somebody takes back what he once had, and that's okay, and we just don't do anything except have a little discussion.
I didn't say that. No, I said none of it.
But you said that blanketing sanctions regime are a mistake and sanctions are a mistake. And I said and what I think and what I saw in Europe, and by the way, they didn't put the sanctions on Russia because of the Crimea. The sanctions were put when the Dutch plane was shot down over the Ukraine by Russian rebels. And that's when the US and the EU finally moved on to sanctions against Russia, economic sanctions. Till then, actually nothing had happened. Yeah, so it was not that the West was super trigger happy sending out economic sanctions. I think they actually were really, I mean, I say because there were differences in also the governments. But I think economic sanctions or personalized sanctions, as we have now since the Magnitsky Act, for particular crimes that are being committed, are actually one of the few options that we have in order to express as political entities that we are not okay with breaking international rules.
Well, wait, you were saying that there was no sanctions after Crimea.
Well, the sanctions were actually introduced half a year later when the plane was, the KLM plane.
The United States had Crimea sanctions that second.
Yeah, but not the Europeans. Not.
Well, that I mean,
and it really became more of a Western kind of movement because of the plane, because it was, you know, there were over 200 people were killed by a rebel movement in the airspace of a country that was also not Russia, and that was the thing that triggered the European Union into sanctions. The US was, of course, always a little bit in a different situation, but I think it's too easy to say that sanctions are always bad, especially because I don't think they were handed out easily.
Well, I mean,
no, we had this discussion before.
Which one?
No, I mean,
that you said sanctions.
No, I didn't. No, but I didn't say that. First of all, I never said that sanctions shouldn't be imposed. What I was saying is that Crimea is an issue, should have been bracketed, and other issues, when sanctions are put forward, they cannot be blanketed. From the United States, I don't know about Europe, actually, I didn't follow exactly the European sanctions, but from the United States, the accusations towards Russia and the trigger-happy sanctions are happening all the time. For example, I mean, I'm not, yes, and the plane and Crimea and whatnot. What I'm trying to say, I guess, not that I disagree on sanctions with you, although I didn't say that it's not a tool that is not necessary. On the other hand, it is a tool that has never worked in any country. That's just that, please remember that it has never worked in any country, however righteous we feel imposing them. Is that I just would like to have a little bit, in order to achieve something, I would like to have a little bit of a detailed approach to this. For example, and we talked about this, Putin's chief of staff, Sergei Kiriyenko, is being sanctioned. I understand why, because he's close to Putin. If he's sanctioned, he may then have influence on the big man. They would say all these people who are, not all these people, but some of the people who are in fact sanctioned away because we're already so prepared for that, that whatever assets we had in foreign countries don't exist anymore. So I think the oligarchs is a much better example, because the oligarchs matter because they all have houses in Austria, they all have houses in Italy, and so on and so forth. The only thing I was saying really is that sanctions, in order to make functional diplomacy, sanctions need to have a tailored approach. That's all I'm saying. And with the Crimea, it is important because it's cited as the first example immediately, but Crimea should have been bracketed right away, and other issues still should have been part of the conversation. I mean, I think here a long time ago after Crimea, we had a panel here, and I was arguing that after Crimea, the West should have imposed, all countries should have imposed blanket sanctions on Russia. So every Russian should be forbidden from entering Europe, because that's how you're going to go to the Kremlin and take out Putin in 5 seconds. Because if you cannot travel to Antalya, or you cannot go to Sanremo festival in Italy, Russians are not going to tolerate that. But I was told that it cannot happen because European Union, I mean, at the time, I think Ireland was very much against the sanctions and so on and so forth. Anyway, all these things are complicated. Once again, I am not a defender of Putin. I am only saying that this Cold War approach, and I hate comparing today to the Cold War because it's not, but this Cold War approach that because they are that, they're evil and we cannot deal with them, that is a problem. And I actually were in the Kreisky Forum, and Bruno Kreisky was the great man who orchestrated the whole relationship of, well, not the whole relationship, but very important part of the Soviet Union relationship with Europe in the 50s and 60s. He was the one who brought Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy here to Austria. Didn't work very well, that meeting, and yet it was an incredibly important meeting. Would be nice if they can learn, I mean, that's not necessarily Kissingerian, but it would be nice if today's politicians could learn from that time.
Yeah, but don't forget, we are here really in Austria. I mean, I can understand that you're also that you're upset with the whole American black and white system, and that this is. But I think it's really a little bit different here. Don't forget, we are here in a country where in 2018, a foreign minister of this republic saw it necessary to invite Putin to her private wedding. And that was exactly 5 months after Sergei Skripal and his daughters were poisoned with a nerve gas, a nerve agent in Salisbury in Britain, broad daylight again. So in that context, I think in Austria, you would rather have more people who are sympathetic to even more realpolitik. I don't even know how we can call this thing a private wedding invitation with the political elite at the time, the government of Austria, at the time when people in Europe were really worried how to deal with Putin after he sort of let all these murders of people happen. That was certainly a sign that the Austrian government at the time sent, which I don't know, can we still call this Kissingerian moment or angewandte Realpolitik?
It's a personal thing.
It's more than a personal thing. It was a political message.
Was a political, well, okay, it was a political, but I don't think it's a Kissinger, because I don't think Kissinger would argue that in order to have good relationship with Putin, you need to invite him to weddings. I wouldn't say that.
I think we agree on that point.
I think Merkel's approach would be called Kissingerian, although I think she would be probably very upset if we call her that. But it is Europe. I mean, once again, it is Europe. I'm more kind of on an American issue, is that you say, hi, I'm a Russian. Oh, like, right, I eat babies under the bed every night.
No, they don't. So we don't think like this in Austria. I think it's already 8 o'clock. So we would like to have a few questions from the floor. Please say who you are so that we know